Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. I'm here with Chris Vanderveen, the 9 News Director of Special Projects. And you and photojournalist Chris Hansen worked on an important and also fairly extraordinary story here, talking first about the 2017 death of Alejandro Gutierrez in Federal Heights, where he died under restraint by police. But the autopsy said that he died of something called excited delirium, and that's the focus of the story.
And excited delirium is an issue. I'm guessing a lot of people, either they're somewhat familiar with or they're not familiar with at all. Police officers are generally fairly briefed on what excited delirium is. People who work in ERs are briefed on what excited delirium is. The problem is that when it gets attached to a death like Alejandro Gutierrez, real quick, back up. What is excited delirium? It is this idea that the body becomes really overdriven, that it is often drug-induced, it's often associated with mental illness, and it's where a person, sort of stereotypical excited delirium, is somebody's taking off their clothes and talking incoherently, and you try to tase them and it doesn't react, and you hit them and they don't react to pain. That's sort of the stereotypical idea of excited delirium. And anybody who works in EMS or ERs, they've probably seen that type of behavior before. The question is it fatal? Does it lead to death? And as our investigation found, why is it that people who die of excited delirium always seem to be restrained in one way or another, or tased or pepper sprayed by law enforcement officers before this happens? And that is the case of Alejandro Gutierrez, a case in Adams County in 2017 that received zero attention. Nobody paid attention to what happened. I think the Denver Post had a very brief article about it, and that was generally it. It sort of disappeared. And I think the contention that I would have is that once excited delirium gets attached to a death, where somebody dies in police custody, that case goes away a little bit.
And that's the background, obviously, to the story. I think the way that the story comes across, you spoke with an expert about the term excited delirium. Without giving away too much of the story here, because this will air again later on tonight here on 9 News, what the expert have to say about this?
Well, there's a forensic pathologist by the name of Dr. Joy Carter Rush. She's the first first black chief pathologist in the country. She has 33 years of experience in this field. She's worked for decades, investigated thousands of deaths. She is a fierce proponent of the use of excited delirium on autopsy reports, particularly when it involves the use of restraint before the death, because in her mind, she calls it a wastebasket term. You just throw it in there and hope the case kind of goes away. And I think that's what happens sometimes, is that, one of the things we're not going to do in this investigation is we're not going to say excited delirium exists or it doesn't exist. There's plenty of people who believe both. There's plenty of people who believe that it does exist. Plenty of people believe that it's a made-up term. I don't want to go down that road right now, because I think in particular it takes the focus away from what I think the focus should be is it being applied in a way that is fair to the person who dies? We all remember the case of Elijah McClain here in Colorado. Initially, the initial autopsy in the Elijah McClain death listed a possible cause of his death, excited delirium. And so a lot of people say, well, what is excited delirium? Why? And even when you understand excited delirium, once you look at the body cameras of the Elijah McClain death, you don't need to be an expert in excited delirium to know that isn't an excited delirium death at all. He doesn't show any of the symptoms, the sort of impervious to pain, superhuman strength, sweating profusely, talking incoherently. He was showing none of those signs, and yet it gets attached to his death. And if you remember, it took a while for the Elijah McClain case to gain national attention. And I think that is what's happening, is that a lot of these deaths that should be our focus in the press, we should be asking more difficult questions about it. Once the term excited delirium gets attached to it, it just kind of flutters away. And I think that's a real problem, because we've found, and we know this is an imprecise list, we know there are many more cases, but we've been able to put together a list of 130 people who have died because of excited delirium in one way or another around the U.S. since 2010. And that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of deaths. Some of them, George Floyd, for example, Elijah McClain, for example, you know really well. But then there's other cases like Alejandro Gutierrez in Adams County that nobody knows. There's another case in Adams County, Paul Egley. Nobody knows. There's a case in Summit County that received very little attention when it happened, a guy by the name of Zach Moffett, who died in the Summit County jail. And initially, they called, the coroner, the medical examiner, called his death excited delirium. Well, it turns out that wasn't the case. Once there was a civil lawsuit in the case, then it was determined that Zachary Moffett was a severe alcoholic in the jail with a very high blood alcohol content and went through severe alcohol withdrawal symptoms for 3 days without appropriate medical care. And that's what the lawsuit said he died of. And eventually, the county must have thought there was some credibility to it because Summit County settled in that case for $3.5 million. So the point being is it being applied too liberally in a way that is allowing some of these deaths to avoid scrutiny, the type of scrutiny I think they deserve?
And I think I kind of want to go back to the term excited delirium here, because based on what you were saying, and I think you alluded to this as well, if you're being restrained by police in a situation, you're going to be acting not yourself, right? I mean, you're going to be acting weird. So where does that line get drawn between acting weird and this being a potential fatal medical condition?
That is an excellent question, because it sort of comes up. A lot of the symptoms of excited delirium, superhuman strength, sweating profusely, impervious to pain, those are symptoms one will exhibit when you think you're going to die. Adrenaline kicks in. All those sort of, like that the body has that innate ability to want to keep itself alive. And therefore, you can start to confuse those symptoms with somebody who's just trying to stay alive. And then you see those symptoms, you say, oh, it's got to be excited delirium. But no, those symptoms were caused by the restraint. It's sort of that weird circular logic that allows it to continue that I think is a real problem. And just like, I mean, we spent 3 years looking into prone restraint deaths. And in many ways, prone restraint deaths are face-down deaths where somebody is handcuffed and they're kept in a prone position for a prolonged period of time. And we know that people can die in that position. But a lot of times, the reason why we gravitated towards the excited delirium investigation is that prone restraint oftentimes and excited delirium go hand in hand. And so what's happening is that people are putting them down. They're struggling to breathe. They're struggling to stay alive. They show symptoms of excited delirium. They die, and then the assumption is, well, I guess they died of excited delirium. But instead, it should be asked, well, did they die of their strength? Once again, and this is a really important point to make, and just like with the prone investigation, I'm not seeing cases where police officers, law enforcement officers, security officers, people who work in hospital settings or jail settings are acting with malice. I'm not seeing that. What I am seeing is a lot of confusion, just like with prone, about why people die at the end of this. And I think that's a real problem. And add to all of this, and I think this is critical, you can be inherently pro-law enforcement officer and believe there's a problem here. Because I guarantee you, from now on, when people die prone or if people die of excited delirium, there's going to be additional scrutiny of the case. There's going to be a civil lawsuit in the case. And the additional factor, post-George Floyd, is that law enforcement officers are now subjecting themselves to criminal prosecution if they mess this up. We've seen examples after example of this around the country. We already know the officers involved in the Elijah McClain death. 2 of them have been charged. And we found we know that obviously the case of George Floyd is well known, and the fate of those officers. We are seeing a new era where district attorneys will not hesitate to criminally charge people, even if they're not acting in malice, but they're acting negligently, with a crime because they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. And so I keep saying, if I can tell if there's any law enforcement officers who are watching, if you think that excited delirium is a thing and that people just magically die of it, you better be willing to bet the rest of your life on that. Because if you're wrong, you can go to jail, you can go to prison for that. And that's a huge deal, and that's a big thing that's changed over the last few years.
Yeah, and I guess excited to learn, and again, you allude to this as well here, Chris, is that it takes the onus and puts it more on the patient rather than the law enforcement officer as well. And that's, I think, an important distinction as well here, right?
And it's like you blame the person for their own death. That they had to be responsible for their heart just stopping, not the officers that were restraining them. There's a case in Louisiana, a 16-year-old with autism by the name of Eric Parsa. Eric Parsa was with his father in Jefferson Parish a few years ago, and he was leaving a business, and he had an outburst, and a deputy was around and called, and that deputy, according to a lawsuit, sat on Eric Parsa's back. He weighs more than 300 pounds. That deputy sat on Eric Parsa's back for 9 minutes. Eric Parsa died. And the coroner called that death excited delirium. That's the kind of stuff that I think begs for additional scrutiny. And I don't feel like these cases have gotten the kind of scrutiny that they deserve. We all know the George Floyd case. We all know the Elijah McClain case. But nobody knows the Paul Egley case. Nobody knows the Alejandro Gutierrez case. Very few people know the Zach Moffitt case. And I think that's important because there are real-life consequences to not paying attention to what's going on.
We are perhaps starting to see some changes, though. I know because you spoke with an El Paso County, the El Paso County
the
coroner.
medical examiner down there, who's also the elected coroner in El Paso County.
And he's refusing to use the term now, I think,
He
right?
says he won't use it, and I think that's an important move. The National Association of Medical Examiners has really not come out with any sort of like definitive statement on whether medical examiners should use the term. But Dr. Leon Kelly is the medical examiner, also the elected coroner down in El Paso County, and he says when law enforcement restraint is utilized, even if it fits all the criteria for excited delirium, he will not put it on the autopsy report. He believes it's not appropriate to put it on the autopsy report. And he also said to us, he goes, there is the consequence. Once you attach excited delirium to a case, it does poof. It does just disappear into the ether. And his point being is that, I mean, his job is not to determine whether the restraint was legitimate or not. He's saying that the restraint is of consequence, more so than the excited delirium. And then he sends it off to the district attorney for criminal review. But like that's an important distinction, and it's not true with all cases. The same medical examiner that put excited delirium on the Alejandro Gutierrez autopsy report, that put excited delirium on the Paul Egley report out of Adams County, also put excited delirium on the Elijah McClain report. And we all know the consequences of that. And so there are some medical examiners in the state that are still, and I don't think it's of malice either. I just think there are some medical examiners that are more likely than others to attach excited delirium, and that's a problem because it's not universally being used. It's not like there's a standard for its use. And there are loads of people that are calling on the National Association of Medical Examiners and the American College of Emergency Physicians, ASAP, to definitively come out and say, don't put this on autopsy reports. And I think that's an important move that a lot of people are calling for, because when it gets attached to an autopsy report, like it did in Alejandro Gutierrez in 2017 in Adams County, Colorado, there is no consequence of the case. And we talked to, and you'll hear tonight, from the daughter of Alejandro Gutierrez, who was 19 years old when she found out that her father died. And for weeks and months, she had no idea what happened to her dad. She still doesn't really know what happened to her dad. She saw the term excited delirium and never seen it before and didn't know what it was when she saw it attached to her father's autopsy report. They would not tell her how her father died for months. Would not even tell her there was a fight. And this is a case where it begged for scrutiny. Alejandro Gutierrez died in Adams County in 2017. The two of the police officers that responded never turned their body cameras on.
And they got, I think,
admonished
for
by the
that,
district
yeah.
attorney, but that was it. Didn't turn their body cameras on until CPR had started. You can hear him twice say on the radio, "I can't breathe." There are things surrounding that sort of begged for additional scrutiny. The Thornton officers that restrained Alejandro Gutierrez refused to do interviews that night with anyone, asking to see the autopsy report before they did interviews, which is not okay.
Are they? Sorry if I don't know this. Are they not? Are they allowed to just not?
They did. In that case, they did, and the district attorney criticized them for that decision. But there was no punishment. There was no repercussions for that. There was nothing happened. They said, we don't want to do it. Now, they said it was at the advice of their lawyer. And when they were later interviewed, and we have the transcripts of those interviews, when they were later interviewed, they were asked, why didn't you do an interview with us the night of this happened? And they said, the advice of our attorney. But that's like...
But if you're going to an attorney the night of, doesn't that...
Yeah, the night of is important. Like, there's very few people that are afforded that opportunity. Let's just put it that way. Law enforcement was afforded that opportunity that night. And therefore, a month later, they did interviews. Did that change their story? I can't say. I have no idea. But it is interesting that they were allowed to do interviews a month after.
So your story will air on 9 News at
Tonight
9 and 10. So be sure to watch for that. Again, excited delirium, the term here. And Chris, thanks so much for shedding light on that term and a very important story.
You bet. I mean, people talk a lot about, I want to see some investigations. I want to see some journalism. We've been working on this case, on this story, since October of last year. This is a long-term investigation, and this isn't done. This is the first part of what I believe will be a multi-part series throughout the year, looking at these instances. I believe strongly in these types of cases. We get some time to really sort of sink our teeth into these types of things, and I hope when people watch it, they have a better understanding of what's going on. That when they hear this term, maybe an alarm bell should go off in their head and say, "Well, is there something else going on here?"
And hopefully it spurs maybe some more change or at least more discussion.
More discussion
about the term.
at the very least.
Yeah. So Chris Vanderveen, thanks so much for joining us here.
You bet.